An analogy to what's going on at Point Reyes would be how we bought up parks in California for redwoods. The state and federal redwood parks were all owned by private landowners at one time. If you can imagine what it would be like today, what people would say if the original owners were still logging the redwoods there, people would be outraged. Yet in many ways, that's the same thing that's happening at Point Reyes, where we paid to protect it as a national seashore, and yet it's still being used for livestock production.
How's this possible? In your opinion, what's allowing them to still be there?
The presence of the livestock industry at Point Reyes is a combination of factors, but one is the political strength of the livestock industry in promoting their activities as essential to being able to feed people, for one thing. Another is, you might say, is the general positive view people have about agriculture in general, the Jeffersonian view that small farmers in particular are somehow the backbone of America, and that gives them the ability to influence the discussion favorably to retain them, even though there are many, many other places to grow livestock in both Marin County as well as California as a whole. California is the fourth or fifth biggest producer of dairy in the entire country. And it's not like there aren't other parts of California outside of our special preserves like Point Reyes where that kind of product can be produced.
I just read something about our nation once again increasing subsidies to keep this industry afloat, or something about dairy farmers, or 73% of their income comes from government support.
One of the things that a lot of people don't understand is that federal subsidies are an important part of the income for many farmers, particularly dairy farmers. And part of the reason for that is that there are dairy farmers in just about every state. So every state senator and congressman has farmers pushing to maintain the production. And the irony is that as we keep all these dairy farms in operation, they produce increasingly larger and larger amounts of milk, which saturates the market, which makes it more difficult for farmers to make a profit. As a result, they clamor for more subsidies. So it's actually harms the average farmer that's trying to produce food economically, because they have to compete against all the subsidized farmers out there that are probably marginal and would disappear if they had to be competitive.
So is our government supporting competitors of these, quote, smaller Point Reyes farms, or is the government equally supporting small guys like Point Reyes?
The government is supporting small guys as well as the larger guys. This is an aside, but in Vermont, for example, Bernie Sanders, even, liberal guy, supports dairy farm subsidies. And yet, Vermont is really not a very good place to be growing dairy products. But there's this whole notion that we have to save every last farmer or we're going to starve. And the really sad thing about that is so much of our land area is used to produce forage for cows, which could otherwise directly support production of food for direct human consumption. So we have, for example, this is overall in the country, but there's almost 90 million acres in the country that's devoted to feeder corn production, which a large percentage of that is fed to livestock, dairy cows as well as beef cattle. And that is some of the most productive land in the country in the Midwest. And if that was just growing corn to feed people, we could feed the whole world on that.
Pro-ranchers like to say that statistics like that are a lie. How do you respond to that?
Well, they're not a lie. You can look them up. Go to the Department of Agriculture websites and find out what the acreage is for different crops grown in the United States. These are government statistics coming from the Department of Agriculture, which, by the way, is very pro-farmer and rancher. And if they are not accurately portraying the situation, that would be impossible to believe is happening.
If they're pro-rancher and pro-farmer, then if anything, their numbers are conservative.
Exactly. Their numbers are going to be conservative. It's the 90 million acres, it varies from year to year, but I just throw that out. 90 million acres of corn grown in this country. California is a little over 100 million acres. So if you could imagine everything from the Oregon border practically down to Mexico, nothing but cornfields. That's what we're talking about, a huge amount of land. And then there's soybeans also grown for livestock feed, and that's about 70 to 75 million acres, of which only 1 or 2% is actually going for tofu and things like that. So if you put the total of just those together, and then one more thing is hay, and that's about 130 million acres. You put all those total together, we have a huge amount of our landscape devoted to growing feed for domestic livestock, primarily cattle.
And in addition to that, there's the 261 million acres for range and forest of this forage of these livestock.
That's true. I'm not even counting the rangelands, and actually that statistic that's just public rangelands. If you put in the private rangelands and the forested areas, like a lot of grazing occurs in forested areas in the southeast United States, altogether, if you put the land that livestock feed is being grown on, the land that's grazed by livestock, both public and private lands, it comes to close to 1 billion acres out of the 2.3 billion acres of the entire United States. So we're talking about a very large percentage of the country is devoted to growing domestic livestock, particularly cattle and dairy.
So if we were actually concerned about feeding humans, we wouldn't be devoting all of this toward raising these gigantic animals that consume all of our natural resources for a privileged meal.
Exactly. And one of the things to remember is beef cattle and dairy cattle are very inefficient means of converting forage into whatever you're trying to convert, meat or milk. Particularly, I'm not an advocate of this necessarily, but if you were just trying to produce meat, you'd be much better off putting that forage, corn, etc., through chickens, which are much more efficient at converting it to meat than a dairy cow or beef cattle. And by the way, every dairy cow winds up as a beef cattle. That's another thing people have to realize, that when they get too old, they just get, turned into hamburger.
And all the baby males are immediately turned into hamburger.
Exactly. But the point I'm trying to get at is that I sometimes make a distinction between dairy cattle and beef cattle, and I should, really the distinction is a matter of timing more than anything, because all cows and cattle wind up in one way or another as meat.
So what's the argument based on then that beef cattle would be better for the park than dairy cattle?
I don't know what that argument would be. Most of the impacts that occur because of dairy cattle would be there with beef cattle. Whether you're talking about pollution of the streams, soil compaction, the spread of weeds, the competition with native herbivores, the conversion of some of the land into hay or other pastures for feeding those animals. I don't know where there would be much difference, to tell you the truth.
I'm trying to remember, and I'm thinking maybe an explanation was that in order to produce the amount of milk they're trying to get out of these cows, they overfeed them. So maybe the amount that dairy cows consume is even higher than what a beef cow consumes?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
So, I just don't see where that would get you very far down the line in terms of reducing impacts to the park. I mean, the point is that these are exotic animals, whether they're beef cattle or dairy cattle. They're not native to the landscape. The goal of the National Park Service is to preserve and protect native vegetation and native animals and give them priority on our public lands. And that is not being done at Point Reyes, and that's the big problem. And even if they converted to chicken farms, I would be against it. It's still not appropriate in a national park unit.
That's another thing. They're possibly gonna diversify into row crops and chickens and pigs. I think that's gonna open up a whole nother bag of problems, because instead of just competing with elk, now all the other wildlife are going to be attracted to these farms and ranches and try to get a piece of the feed for these other animals. Or in the case of something like a chicken or a pig, maybe a predator even wants to try and take them.
Well, of course, that's the problem with any of the kind of production. And the real issue is, what should private economic interests dominate our public lands? And that's what's occurring here. These are private businesses using public resources for their private profit. And that fundamentally is the ethical and ecological issue that's at hand. We're degrading public resources to enrich private individual pocketbooks.
Which sounds absolutely ridiculous, and the only explanation I can come up with for it is that we are so used to saying that the farmer is the good guy that it's unbelievable to us to consider them to be the bad guy.
Well, if there was a rational review of the ecological costs of agriculture, I am convinced that it would show that ag is the number one environmental problem in this country in terms of land use. The ecological footprint of agriculture is huge. It is almost always negative compared to what a landscape without agriculture as part of it would be. And it has, so what we have to do is, yes, we have to feed ourselves, but we should be limiting that to as small an area as possible and as efficient as possible, rather than using an inefficient method like raising livestock to feed ourselves.
Go into how much of the food produced every year is wasted, just adding insult to injury. But
exactly. There's a lot of arguments you could make about agriculture, but our agricultural system, we have this fear of famine, I guess, that goes back to the Middle Ages, and of course is occurring in some other parts of the world right now. But usually that famine is a matter of distribution of food rather than the actual production of food. And we have plenty of areas to produce food. When you look at the acreage statistically of vegetables and fruit grown in this country, now admitting that we also import some, but the amount of land that produces about half of our fruits and vegetables is only about 5 to 8 million acres of land. And that's the vegetables that's feeding a lot of this whole country on a very small amount of land. People have no idea how little land we really need. If we were growing vegetables and fruits primarily, we would need to disrupt with agriculture. And then if you throw in wheat is probably the next, as a grain is a big thing. There's about 60 million acres in wheat production. But even that, throw that in there, some grains, and then put in vegetables and fruit, and you're still at less land being affected than just what we have in feeder corn for livestock.
Did you happen to see the Bloomberg report that broke all that down?
I did not, no.
Okay. It's interesting. Let's dip into some of these other categories of what I call propaganda.
Okay.
One that's been on my mind a lot now that we're heading into summer and the hills are turning brown.
Yes.
Is the idea that cattle are a wildfire suppressant.
Okay. The idea that cattle can protect landscapes from wildfire is extremely exaggerated for several reasons. One, almost all large fires are wind-driven events. And under those conditions of drought, low humidity, high temperatures, and extreme wind, you have embers being blown sometimes miles ahead of a fire front. And the fire will find any fuel that's out there to burn. I've seen 1-inch stubble burn with the wind behind it for, across a whole mile of a pasture that had been grazed. So the idea that grazing is going to reduce fire possibilities is greatly exaggerated. Another problem is that grazing often spreads weeds and other highly flammable grasses and plants. In a lot of parts of the country, cheatgrass is a major invader that comes in with livestock grazing and is highly flammable because it dries out early in the year. That doesn't really apply to Point Reyes, but as a gross exaggeration across the West, grazing actually increases the flammability of the landscape by promoting things like cheatgrass. And the third thing is that if you graze it down to the point where you've got like a golf course like expanse, you're harming all the other things that depend on that grass for survival, whether it's hiding cover for small nesting birds, small mammals, whether it's the seeds that birds and mammals would use, or the insects like grasshoppers and others that would feed on that grass. So you're taking that food and shelter and cover out of the picture. Again, this is a national park. This is a place where we have to promote native wildlife, and the elimination of that grass cover negatively impacts those wildlife species. It's been shown over and over again, the best way to protect your house is not to go out and try to eliminate fuel over large parts of the landscape. It's to eliminate the fuel right next to the house. Reduce the pine needles on your rooftop. Have gravel maybe around the foundation of your house. Keep the grass right immediately next to your house kept low. But it's not going, you don't have to do those things for more than about 100 feet from a house. Beyond that, you get no additional benefit.
You touched on this, but I want to dig deeper into it because I like to play ecologist, even though I'm not an ecologist. But as I drove out to Point Reyes the last time, the hills were already turning. It was summertime,
right,
getting hot. But once I got there and was looking out at the elk reserve is green. And I wonder if, native plants aren't more perennial and naturally resistant to fire than all of these plants that have been introduced.
Well, I think you're on the right pathway there. One of the things, the native grasses will also brown up too, but they generally stay greener longer into the summer than the exotic plants. So you shorten, in a sense, the potential fire season with native grasses over the exotic grasses. The exotic grasses create a longer cycle of when fire can occur. So in that sense, you're correct. And the other part about the exotic grasses is that they tend to be annuals, which they respond greatly to rainfall. So if you have a lot of rain like last winter in California, then you get a lot of growth of the annual grasses, whereas the perennials are sort of more even-tempered, you might say. They stay the same year in, year out. They do respond to drought and so forth too, but for the most part, their biomass production doesn't go on the same kind of exaggerated cycles that you'll see with annual grasses.
All right, well, let's stick with the plant theme, and talk about the claims that cattle grazing promotes native plants. I can barely say that with a straight face.
The first thing you have to ask is, how did these plants survive in the days before there were cattle to enhance them? So that is the first issue. Now, part of one of the arguments that is made is that by eating some of the exotic grasses, it will allow the native grasses to grow. The problem with that argument is that cattle they're selective feeders, and they prefer, in most cases, the perennial native grasses over the exotics. So the first thing they're going to take out is going to be the native vegetation in many cases, unless there's something about it, it's got thorns or something like that that discourages the grazing of them. But in general, what we see is that where there are livestock grazing is that the thing that they take out over time is the perennial grasses and the native species, and leave behind the exotics because they're less desirable. It's sort of like a child at dinner. You put some peas down on the plate and you put the ice cream right next to them and see which one they eat first. And if they can eat ice cream all night, they'll eat the ice cream before they ever get to the peas. And that's kind of the same situation with cattle. They'll choose the native vegetation, in part because native vegetation tends to be better for them. In other words, it's higher in protein and energy than a lot of the exotic plants. And that's exactly why what we call weeds proliferate, because weeds are plants that are not preferred by the livestock in their grazing. And so they tend to grow better and are left behind, and the native plants that are tasty and better for the livestock are eliminated. I was going to say there's one thing, they have these very small areas in California of vernal pools, and they have shown that vernal pools, and this is a very special situation, but vernal pools gradually get invaded by the exotics, and so cattle grazing is one method that they use to give the natives in the vernal pools a competitive advantage, because it's a special situation. They'll bring cattle in for a very short period of time, early in the spring before the rest of the plants are blooming. They'll graze out the exotic grasses, and so they move them in and move them out really quick. It's just really not applicable to just grazing in general across the landscape.
The park sent me their grazing management plan. They're including grazing as an inherent future of the park, which to me says they aren't even seriously considering getting rid of the ranches.
Mm-hmm.
This came out of Berkeley, and I've seen Sonoma and Davis and Berkeley start a lot of papers by intermingling the words ecological and economic value of cattle grazing.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like these people are directly influenced by the financial support that institution gets from those industries. Is there a better way to explain something like that?
Well, I think you have hit on an important thing for people to consider, which is follow the money. If you're a professor at a university, particularly if you're in a department that has anything to do with livestock and land management, you get funded by the Department of Agriculture, sometimes industry directly, whether we're talking about the livestock industry or the timber industry. And so you have a strong incentive not to criticize those industries. And there's several reasons if you understand how academics works. One, if you're a professor at one of these universities, you get your pay raises and so forth based on publications. How do you get publications? Well, you have graduate students that do a lot of the field work for you and a lot of the research for you. How do you support grad students? Well, you have to get grants and funding to support those grad students. So you have this whole money train that is fostering a certain perspective. And what I see a lot of times is it's not that these people who work at these institutions are deceptive or taking data and misrepresenting what they found, but it's how they emphasize what their findings are. So I'll give you an example. Years ago, there was a brochure put out that summarized the research of one paper and the title was How Livestock Grazing Improved Riparian Areas. and that was the title. But I called up the various places that were listed to find out what was the background on the improvement. And in every situation, what you found is they actually reduced livestock grazing. So, for example, a place that might have been grazed 5 months of the year, they reduced it to 3 months, and the riparian areas got better. Or they fenced the riparian area and kept the cattle out of it entirely, and the riparian area got better. So it didn't get better with grazing. It got better because you eliminated grazing. They use these situations to say that on, Crystal Creek in Colorado or whatever it might have been, we saw an improvement with livestock grazing. And then you find out why it improved. It was because they maybe fenced the riparian area. They may have said they fenced the riparian area, but their emphasis is to say that it improved because there was livestock grazing still occurring in the area, when in fact you were reducing the livestock grazing. To make another analogy, it might say that coyote populations improved with hunting, poisoning, and trapping, because you can measure that there's more pups produced in reaction to it. So you could have a whole paper that says, coyotes benefit from being shot, poisoned, and trapped. But if you look at the details, they're not. It's questionable whether you would call that a benefit.
Wow, it's painful.
So that could be what you're seeing from those universities. So in other words, they have an incentive, a financial incentive to produce papers that favor livestock production. And I see this all the time in other areas where, for example, the people who might question livestock production are not in range departments. They're in botany departments. They're in geology departments. They're in zoology departments. They're not in the range department, because you cannot survive in a range department if you question livestock production. I have a friend who was in the Oregon State Range Department, and his motto was, "I don't do cows." And he was doing research on riparian areas that showed that cattle grazing had damage to riparian areas. They eventually pushed them out of the department. They would not tolerate having somebody in the range department who was so obviously questioning livestock grazing. It would stick by me, but I told him, well, I don't want to jeopardize your tenure, so I didn't go public with this. But it was known by people in the department what went on and so forth. So it could be documented. He might speak privately about it now. I still don't think he wants to have it, be a big issue.
Sure. Oh, I know that song and dance.
Yeah. So, and the same thing happens in the federal agencies too. If you're not a team player, so to speak, with this, whatever happens to be the policy at the time, your life can be made miserable. You can be reassigned. I have a friend that works for the Forest Service right now, totally unrelated to livestock raising, but he got in trouble with the agency because he challenged ranchers about access to public land. Well, the ranchers called up the senators in Montana. The senators called up the head of the Department of Agriculture, the head of the Forest Service. The Forest Service called up the forest supervisor, and he was reassigned. And he lost his job as the district ranger.
How is it that ranchers just have this direct line to politicians? Is it because agriculture is so deep-rooted in American history, or is it actual financial or other influences that are being sent to that direction?
It's all of those things, and there's another factor. I did some research. This was a while back, so it's somewhat dated, but I was amazed at the political power of the livestock industry in Montana and the ag industry. And at the time that I did my research, which is probably almost 20 years ago now, and I don't think it's changed that much, but at that time, 77% of all county commissioners in Montana listed their occupation as agriculture, primarily ranching. 55% of the state legislators were in ag. The governor, the lieutenant governor, and both our senators and our congressmen were all in agriculture. And yet agriculture only less than 1% of the population of Montana is involved in agriculture. So you have less than 1% of the population controlling the whole political system. And why is that? Well, I had a hypothesis, a couple of them. One is this whole positive view. A guy stands around and says, I'm a rancher. People automatically like him and trust him. And then there's the fact that most ranchers in places like Montana have been there for a long time, so they have a lot of name recognition. As you know, name recognition helps you in politics. And then another factor was that the legislature in Montana, in any event, meets only in the winter months. Who can take off time in the winter months for 3 or 4 months to go to work at the state legislature without it, affecting your income? Well, in the wintertime, if you're a rancher or even a farmer, it's the downtime. At most you're feeding some hay to the cows in the pasture, which almost anybody could do. And then finally, at least in Montana at the time, county commissioners didn't get paid very much, but you weren't required to work full time. So at the time I did my research, the county I lived in, if you were a county commissioner, you only had to work 2 days a week. And you didn't make much money. But we could not recruit anybody to go run for that position because most people that had anything on the ball could make full-time work somewhere else. And they couldn't be doing something like county commissioner part-time. So all those things, I think, contribute to the direct line that ranchers have. A lot of times they're just calling their buddy up who's a senator or a congressman. That's probably not as true in California, but it's certainly true in a lot of western states.
Well, that leads straight to Jared Huffman. Yep. What happened with him?
I think Jared Huffman is probably, this is the problem with him. He's under a lot of pressure, I think, from the local food guys, actually, the foodies, who want to have what they call local agriculture, see it survive. They think there's a couple of myths there. One is this idea that if you don't have a farm out there, it's suddenly going to be a subdivision. And so a lot of people living in these urban areas don't want to see, ranches and farms carved up into housing tracts. And that's a whole myth, and I could explain why it is. But if it was such a good conservation strategy, you wouldn't have sprawl anyplace, would you? So, relying on ranching or farming to prevent sprawl obviously doesn't work. But there's a lot of people who buy into that mythology. Another factor, I think, with Huffman is that there's, as I mentioned, a lot of people in Marin County and the Bay Area who believe that the farms are producing food for their direct consumption. And it would be very interesting to see where the products of the dairy farms, even there at Point Reyes, are sold. I looked into it in Vermont when I lived in Vermont, and 95% of the dairy industry in Vermont was exported. So the idea that you were feeding people in Vermont was a myth, because they're selling their product on the open market, and they're selling, in the case of Vermont, they're selling it to New York and Philadelphia and all the big urban markets. But there's that idea that we're going to feed people in Mill Valley or something with milk coming from the dairy farms out there at Point Reyes. And I think that's a contributing factor.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I had that conversation with a local, and he admitted, he's like, no, most of it's exported.
Yeah, I would think
the restaurants in town aren't selling local as much as you might suspect.
Yeah, well, the thing is, with modern transportation, you can move stuff around pretty quickly and keep it fresh. I mean, when I go to the grocery store where I am in Oregon right now, a lot of the food we have here is produced in California, of course, and it was just picked maybe the day before and shipped up overnight, and it's out on the grocery store shelf the next morning. So it's very quick and fresh, and yet it's not sold locally. It's it's coming from 1,000 miles away.
So this makes me want to talk about the word sustainable and local and all those other buzzwords.
Yes.
I mean, we already basically explained that the amount of resources used to grow a cow for a small amount of calories there is pretty ridiculous to even begin a conversation about sustainability, but maybe there's more that you could add to that for people who, like I used to be, thought, nope, I got to have my meat.
Well, there's a couple of things. The term sustainability has gotten very distorted in my view. It usually implies economic sustainability, not ecological sustainability. So I'll change the subject slightly. If you hear about sustainable forestry, as an example, it's about keeping enough trees available to keep the mill operating, but not necessarily what sustains the forest ecosystem. And I've been to many sustainable forestry examples where, in my view as an ecologist, they're highly degraded ecosystems. They are better perhaps than the rape and plunder forestry that existed a century ago, but in terms of ecosystems sustainability, they're not good examples. So that's the first thing. A lot of the word sustainability is about economic sustainability, not ecological sustainability.
What you said about forestry is the exact same thing with fishing industry.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, sustaining the fishing industry, but not necessarily the aquatic ecosystems. And so we have that's a real problem with the use of the term. The other thing is we have, and this is a bias that you see, you talk about working landscapes all the time. And where did that term come from? Well, it was originated actually in Maine with the timber industry, which was under a lot of pressure for its practices. And somebody came up with a brilliant idea that if we call these working landscapes, that sounds good to Americans, because we have this whole puritanical thing about, we don't want to have people being lazy around and so forth. And so a working forest is one that's positive, as opposed to something like a park or wilderness area. That forest is just sitting there. It's not producing anything for money for people, so to speak, they think. Although it's producing clean water, homes for wildlife, etc. But the idea that using the landscape for economic activities is very pervasive in this country as a positive thing. And there's no...
If you're not working the land, you're wasting the land.
Yeah, you're wasting the land. And the question also is that, are you having this land, is it when you talk about sustainability, the time scale is important. The problem is a lot of these degradations happen over a decades-long period. The topsoil in the Midwest, for example, let's say it used to be 15 feet deep or whatever, and now maybe it's 8 feet deep. So, over 100 years of farming, you've lost half of the topsoil there, and yet you wouldn't call that sustainable, but you can still grow stuff there because there's still half of the soil that's left. And so you haven't totally degraded it, and it takes a long time for a lot of these things to manifest themselves. The other thing about sustainability is, particularly again, is what we're talking about in a national park unit, is we want to sustain the native ecosystems and the native wildlife. And it's just not appropriate to, even if the farming there was sustainable, which I would argue it is not, but even if it was, that's an inappropriate place to be practicing sustainability. Do it on the other private lands. There's a lot of private land in Marin County and in the rest of California. Only 50% of California is public. So 50%, or about 50 million acres, is private. Go out there and show me your sustainability. We don't need to do it in a national park unit.
Here's one that's slightly complicated because it sounds like the ranchers are trying to do a good thing, and this has to do with the silage. In order to reduce the amount of feed they bring in from elsewhere, the argument is that growing silage allows them to do it locally and cut down on all the transportation and the importing costs. Obviously, being as how it was meant to be set aside for the natural resources and the wildlife unimpaired, obviously I don't think that any of it should be taking place there. But how would you respond to just the idea of silage growing and mowing is better than importing hay, and that makes it a good thing?
I don't have a really good argument against that. That might be a good thing if you think that the area should be farmed, but that's the whole rub is that's just an inappropriate use of that landscape, and the you're better off just doing it someplace else. I mean, this comes down to what should be done appropriately on our public lands. You could say, by the same token, that maybe I don't know if there's oil and gas right there at Point Reyes, but maybe we ought to have oil wells there too, so you don't have to pump the oil coming in from Southern California or Wyoming or whatever. Yeah, that would be better, I guess you could say, from a local production, but maybe that's not the place you want to be doing the production.
A guy who works in sharks with me and that I thought was an environmentalist, when he heard I was doing this project, he went to the defense of the ranchers, and his first thought was, you don't want that land to be developed, do you?
Right.
If we don't have those ranchers there, it might be developed. And I said, well, I don't understand. The land was already bought by Congress for it to be a national seashore. So is there a real threat of it getting resold or used for land for real estate development or something like that?
Absolutely not. That's the whole absurdity of it, is that it's public land. It will not be developed because it is public land. And the development that occurs is because of agriculture. And I don't want to get into this because it's a very nuanced thing, but in a lot of cases, I can make the argument that the developed landscape actually is better for biodiversity than the farming in a lot of cases.
Wow.
For example, I'll give you an example of what I mean. If you go out into a wheat field out, like in Montana, for example, you have a single plant species growing over thousands of acres that's cut down every year, that often is soaked in pesticides and fertilizers. That's a biological desert. You put in a bunch of housing tracts and they got shrubs and trees. I noticed this years ago in my house in Livingston, Montana, because I used to have about 5 or 6 species of birds that would just nest in my yard alone. And so I went around the block of my neighborhood and, I identified hundreds of birds nesting just on one block in my town. And I thought, compare this to a same size, whatever the block is, 5 acres or something of a wheat field, and you wouldn't have any of that. And you don't have native insects or anything. And I'm not trying to be an advocate of subdivisions, but there's this knee-jerk reaction that's not very looking at the situation very critically, that agriculture, for the most part, is worse for biodiversity and wildlife than a lot of other things that could be on that landscape.
Because of some of the unhealthy habits that we use in order to increase production.
That, and also the fact that you usually are favoring 1 or 2 species over, thousands and thousands of acres. A hayfield is the same thing. A hayfield is usually just a couple of species of grasses, and so it's not very diverse. It's usually exotic plants as well, which means that you don't have your native insects that would feed on it, your native fungi. You don't have cover for when it's cut for the wildlife and so forth. So a hayfield is also a biological disaster. It's not, just because deer will run through it once in a while doesn't mean that it's a good thing for wildlife. Open space is not the same thing as good wildlife habitat, and that's a thing that people don't get.
Let's come back to that.
Okay.
That makes me think about mulch. You familiar with mulch?
No.
Marine Agricultural Land Trust. All over when you're driving through that area and you see hills that don't have buildings, but they are being grazed on.
Yeah.
You see these signs that say protected forever by mulch.
Yep.
And I'm thinking, protected by whom, for what?
Yes.
Because just because there's not a building there doesn't mean that it's friendly to the wildlife.
Exactly.
Well, that's exactly the point. If you're looking at, the effects of agriculture, I'm most familiar with ranching in the interior West. But if you're a wolf, you're not protected if you get on a ranch. If you're looking at the riparian areas that are now converted to hayfields that used to be willow patches and other native vegetation. That's not good for you. If you look at the streams that are polluted by the sewage from the livestock, the feces and so forth, that's not good. So in terms of overall habitat for wildlife, agriculture in general is is degrading for native plants and animals.
I drive through those hills on a weekly basis. I've never once seen any animal other than a cow on those hills. I mean, like at some point you think you got to catch a glimpse of a deer. I haven't.
Well, it's true, and one of the things that happens is, at least with larger mammals like elk and so forth, they're socially displaced by the presence of livestock. That's another thing people don't understand. Given a choice, they will not intermingle with cattle. And I remember years ago, there was a request from Bugle magazine. They wanted a picture of elk grazing in the same place as cattle. They had to ask for 3.5 years because nobody had that picture. Why did nobody have that picture? Because it basically doesn't happen unless the elk are just starving in a really harsh winter where they have no other choice but to feed alongside of cattle. But mostly, if they have a choice and they can, they won't go there, which means that they're displaced usually into less suitable habitat because the cattle, if you assume that they would otherwise be in that place, but they won't be there because the livestock is, so they're in a place where they're maybe more vulnerable to predators, or the forage isn't as good and the hiding cover isn't as good. So it has a real negative impact.
Well, we're starting to see more of that. I've been able to get my own footage of them grazing next to each other. And you just touched on a really interesting point. It's like, are conditions getting bad enough for the elk to where they are forced to go and do something they wouldn't normally do?
Well, it depends on the situation. Yeah, that's what happens. They do. It's just like, this is a terrible analogy, but it's just like cannibalism in people. You're in a plane wreck up in the Andes, and normally people don't eat other people, but if there was no other food around, some people might eat the dead people that are there. So yes, in a very stressful situation, you get behavior that wouldn't otherwise exist.
Before we continue on with the elk, which I want to do, I want to go back to the point you made earlier and try to summarize it and see if I get it correctly.
Okay.
As opposed to agricultural land, your home was actually a preferred habitat for birds because you don't allow pesticides and things like that on your property?
Well, that's part of it. I think they're there because I have a lot more habitat too. I've got shrubs and trees, and so the diversity of places that an animal can hide and nest, etc., is much greater. And I have frogs and snakes and even, unfortunately, to my mind, sometimes deer come into my yard too. But
so instead of it being just this monoculture field of the exact same thing, you had a diversity.
Yes, and I've tried to plant native species as well. So, I had to live with what was at the house when I bought it, which some exotic plants were already there. But everything I've planted since then just about has been native to the area and something that some wildlife species can use. It might be berries, it might be the leaves, it may be the tree trunk. I've got parts of trees that are dead. I don't cut them off because birds use them to nest in, so forth. So I try to make it friendly, and even like bees. I've got a lot of bees live in dead logs on the ground and in the ground. And there are a lot of native bees. I've got native bees in my yard, and I leave dead logs in the ground there to provide them a home. And I can see they drill holes in it, and in the winter those holes are filled up with stopped up, and then I come back in the spring and they're out. They took off. They live their cycle there.
Mm-hmm. Now that leads to a whole nother topic. I think about that all the time when I see public land service coming through and clearing out dead branches and trunks. I'm like, you know what? what did this planet ever do without humans? I'm pretty sure
Now,
that those dead branches and trunks serve a purpose to something.
exactly. The assumption that we're improving things is incredible arrogance in most cases.
Arrogance.
And the first thing I always ask is, what good is it, or what is its ecological role? And I'll give you an example. I was on a field trip not long ago with a bunch of foresters, and they were claiming that they were going to cut down these trees because they were going to die otherwise from root rot, which is ironic already. So we'll make sure they die by chainsawing them. I said, well, so I'm with all these guys, quote, foresters, right? They're supposed to study forest ecosystems and so forth. So what's the ecological role of root rot? And I just got blank stares.
Right.
And I said, you already assumed that this is a bad thing. Well, what could the role be? Root rot's been around, forever. It must have some role in the ecosystem, some function. And they didn't even have a clue. They didn't even ask that question. I didn't have the answer because, it's not something that I've studied. But I don't assume automatically that it's a negative, or that it doesn't play some role in the ecosystem.
Am I giving nature too much credit to say that if it didn't have some sort of a positive role, nature would have gotten rid of it a long time ago?
Well, exactly. Yes, you're exactly right. Nature evolution would have eliminated these things if it didn't have some role. Just to use an example, forest fire as an example, after a high severity fire, some of the highest biodiversity found in the whole West is in highly burnt forests. And most people assume that a burnt forest is a bad thing, but there's a lot of species out there that live in mortal fear of a green forest. They actually depend on those charred forests for their survival.
Wow.
And so to assume that just because it burned up that it has no useful purpose, no, there's a lot of species that are attracted to those burnt forests and rely on what has resulted as the forest, whether it's the snags, whether it's the logs when they fall to the ground, like I said, the bees that burrow into those logs on the ground. The native bees they actually increase after a high severity fire.
Wow.
So there's a lot of species out there that, if we're going to say cost benefit from, say, a fire. And but the automatic assumption is, this is destroying the landscape, and it's inaccurate.
I would look at these neighborhoods and the ongoing battle every single day of humans trying to grow things that aren't supposed to be growing here instead of letting native plants.
Right. Well, that's one of his arguments, is that it not only is good for wildlife, but it's easier to maintain and care for. And then up here, a big thing is the fire issue. Certain plants are more fire resistant than others too. So that's another sort of sub niche that he advertises, that I can help you pick out plants that are less likely to burn, which will protect your house.
Are you comfortable talking about the elk?
Yeah, sure. Let's talk about it.
Well, I hear pro ranching people say that, you have to manage the elk populations, or letting the elk populations grow beyond whatever is cruel toward the elk. But what would happen in this environmentalist ideal situation where the ranches are gone and we take that elk reserve fence down and allow them to spread the way that they, I would assume, or would like to spread? What's bad?
There's nothing bad about it. You would have evolution operating, which means that some elk would die, either because of lack of nutrition, because of predation, because of disease, or whatever it might be. But then the ones that are left are going to be, the ones that are most fit and in the best shape. And particularly in Point Reyes, because of the limited connection to the rest of the, quote, mainland, it's essentially an island situation. Mm-hmm. So you would have probably the elk population grow to a certain point and then start to, have problem. I'm not sure what the native predator situation is there. I think there's cougar out there. Is there not, or not?
I heard rumors about one being seen at some point in the last decade. That's about the extent of it.
See, that's one of the problems with having the dairy farms there. That should be one of the primary things that they're doing at the Park Service is to restore the native predators, and cougar being one of them. Uh, like like wolves have been restored to Yellowstone. I did see cougar tracks one time in Golden Gate National Recreation Area. It was so cool because I'm looking down on San Francisco. I'm up high. I'm up, towards Mount Tamalpais or someplace around there. And here in the mud are cougar tracks, and I'm like, I can see San Francisco 15 air miles away or something.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so cougars can survive, particularly if they're not persecuted. And a place like Point Reyes is a perfect place for them. And they would, prey on most likely the younger calves when they could, but they can take down an adult elk too. And that would be their primary prey. And the cougars would help to keep the elk, along with disease and all the other stuff, somewhat in check. All these wildlife populations oscillate to a degree, though. So they're not a steady state. And that's one of the problems with management is most managers want to keep a steady state. That's not the natural situation. Most of these animal populations will grow bigger and then drop down lower. And they have an equilibrium, you might say, where they sort of hover around, but they're not steady state. And that's one of the problems with a lot of wildlife management is the goal is a steady state because they're particularly outside of parks. They're trying to produce a certain number of animals for hunters to kill, so that they have this whole idea we've got to, we don't want the animal population to crash, but we don't want too many to be out there because they're going to cause problems with the ranchers and so forth. So we're trying to keep them at this, objective level of that isn't too much but isn't too little.
Well, I have two subjects for you to address.
Yeah.
One is, was the Park Service justified in allowing the elk to die during the drought without the freedom to find water? And two, would introduction of predators, such as cougars, cause a problem with the tourists or recreational use of the area because humans just aren't used to having to deal with predators in an area like Point Reyes?
Well, let me say no. The elk shouldn't have been prevented from getting to water. That's a crime. There's no reason why this is a national park. They should have priority.
They called it animal husbandry.
Yeah, well, that's bogus. It's a national park. We don't husband animals in national parks. We allow natural processes to occur, and part of allowing the natural processes is to give them the freedom of the run of the place.
Yep.
And allow them to sustain themselves. As far as cougars, what you will find with cougars is I don't have the statistic on the top of my head, but there's like almost nobody has ever been killed by cougars in this country. I mean, it's very, very low numbers. And most time you don't even know there's cougar around because they're so secretive. I remember I was in Big Bend National Park, for example, and I came upon these people with radio tracking stuff. And I said, what are you tracking? They said, oh, cougars. And I said, oh, is there one around here? And the guy said, you just walk within 20 feet of one.
Wow.
And so the idea that they're a threat to people, I went to grad school down at UC Santa Cruz. There's cougar living all around the campus there. You got to be a little judicious, particularly with your kids or something like that. But in general, the cougars don't generally attack people. In fact, one of the reasons why you have conflicts when you have hunting and so forth is that adult male cougars generally keep younger males at bay. They kill them a lot of times. So you have fewer of them. And the young males in particular are poor hunters, and they don't know the territory, so they're more likely to attack livestock or even maybe a person. And if you look at the records of cougar attacks, you'll find it almost invariably they say it was a year-old male cougar or something like that.
Yep.
And so indicating that lack of experience leading to the conflict. So
I'm going to switch over to sharks for a moment and see if you think this is too far-fetched? I've heard it proposed that the culling of sharks, which targets the big ones, because those are the ones we're scared of, actually can increase our chances of being bitten by juveniles for the exact reason that you just gave with the cougars. The big ones put the younger ones in check, or, if nothing else, give them guidance about what they're supposed to be doing. But that's too much for people, that's too much credit for people to give to a fish. For a cougar, they might be able to stretch their minds to there, but for a shark, they're like, no, it's a mindless killer.
Yeah, I can't talk about shark ecology except to say that a lot of times, how does an animal get to be a mature animal? By avoiding conflicts with humans. That's at least with cougars the case. So the dominant male cougars they're usually 4 or 5 years old. You don't get to be a 4 or 5 year old cougar and live if you're stupid about what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't wander into people's backyards when you're a 4 or 5 year old cougar. You do if you're a 1 year old cougar, but you don't necessarily, and you probably don't kill cattle if you're a 4 or 5 year old cougar, because you would have been killed off for that.
So you're saying that the cougars have an actual understanding that hunting domestic livestock leads to them being killed?
No, I don't think they have an understanding of that. It's just that certain cougars are much more inclined. It's like in any population. You have a certain percentage of the population is going to be more inclined to do certain behaviors. Well, the ones that are doing behaviors like that are eliminated from the population. Even in California, where cougar hunting is no longer allowed, they can still kill cougars for livestock depredation.
Sure.
So that any cougar that does that is eliminated from the population, and the ones that survive are the ones that don't do that. So, and that's one reason why you don't want to randomly kill cougars, because you might have a cougar sitting in your backyard that's totally disinclined to, go after Fifi the dog or go after a cow or whatever, and keeps other cougars out of that area because they maintain that territory. Wow. So if you just go randomly, like hunting does in most states, just shoot the cougar that you happen to see, you're disrupting that whole social makeup, so that now you might have that spot. If it's a good spot, in other words, the habitat is there, that's the reason the cougar is there, because there's good food to be had there. So now you take out the cougar that isn't problematic just because you randomly shot it, and now you have a cougar that might move in that isn't very experienced at hunting, or maybe is more inclined to attack livestock because for whatever reason, it's hurt, or it's not well, a skillful hunter. And so now you've just created a big problem. We see this in Bend. I'll just give you an example. There was a cougar that they shot that was found in a neighborhood here in February because it was a harsh winter, deer were all in people's houses, backyards and stuff. So they shot that cougar, and it was a young male. And within 1 month, another cougar was sighted in exactly the same spot.
Wow.
They shot that one.
Yeah.
And within another month, another cougar was there, which they never did capture because by then it was spring and the deer were spreading out and the cougar left the area. So they actually created a conflict there that if they hadn't shot the first cougar, probably wouldn't have opened up that spot for the second cougar, which they also killed.
Amazing. I feel like we are unintentionally flirting with a comparison to the flaws of trophy hunting.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas, hunters like to call themselves predators, but they do the exact opposite of what a predator in the wild does. We go out and remove the role models and the ones that need to be there.
Yep. And
there's a trickle-down effect of problems.
Oh, they've shown that over and over again with studies that hunters, particularly trophy hunters, but hunters in general, take the prime animals, the prime reproductive animals, whereas the predators tend to take the weaker ones, the older ones, the younger ones. And in fact, I have a friend that studies wolves. It's a very interesting thing. It's surprising is that the number of elk a lot of times actually increases with predators around, which would seem counterintuitive. Mm-hmm. But she thinks that what's going on, okay, we'll just use a hypothetical. You have 100 elk out there, and there's only enough forage for 100 elk. And 30 of those elk are calves. Another 20 are females that don't produce young anymore because they're too old. And so you only have 50, and maybe 10 of them are males. So you only have about 40 elk that are really reproductive, okay? So now you come in with hunters, and they're taking the prime elk out of that population. And they're leaving behind the calves, and they're leaving behind the cows that don't produce, whereas the cougar or the wolves come in, and they're taking the calves.
Yeah.
And they're taking the old cows, which leaves more forage for the reproductively, the cows that are able to reproduce.
Mm-hmm.
They have more food, and their calves are more likely to survive because they have more food. And so that contributes to the population actually growing with predation. That's their theory.
Again, similarity to sharks. If you have a reef that has sharks on it, you have more fish. It's hard for humans who are completely divorced from nature to understand this, but you remove that predator and suddenly you don't have everything else either.
Yeah. No, it's a very a good example of how that works. And so anyway, it would seem to me that getting elk throughout Point Reyes all the way around the whole park, and then reintroducing cougars into that population would make it a much more enhanced ecosystem function, and much more in line with the main purpose that we set aside our national parks for.
What a problem to have to deal with. Too much wildlife.
Yeah.
All right. I think for the chit chat, we'll call it there.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you doing this. This is, I see, and maybe you do too, but if we can't hold the line here, I see this as a threat to our park system throughout the country.
Absolutely.
Because so many of our parks either have ongoing things like livestock grazing, even though it's public land, and that or logging. And if you can't say that we're going to set these things apart from extractive industries, then what hope do we have? So.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really want to go back to that Native American saying, but if we claim that we have to have Point Reyes as well in order to feed people, then we're literally living the prophecy that not until the last tree is cut down, the last fish caught, do we realize we can't eat money. I mean, we need every last inch of land.
I got a saying here. Here's a good thing, so long as you got the camera still rolling.
Yeah.
I can't believe that as a country we are not rich enough to set aside places like Point Reyes from extraction and economic interests. If we're that poor, we're in a lot more trouble than anybody imagines.
Amen.